History is often presented to us as a linear path of progress, a steady climb from ignorance to enlightenment. We like to believe that science is a sterile, objective field where facts inevitably rise to the top like cream. But history is written by the victors, and in the world of nutritional science, the victors were not those who held the truth, but those who held the power. For decades, we have lived inside a carefully constructed narrative, a story told so often and with such absolute conviction that it became indistinguishable from reality. It was a story that changed the way the entire world ate, the way we looked at our dinner plates, and ultimately, the way we sickened and died. It was the story that fat was the enemy. This dogma didn't just appear out of thin air. It was forged in the 1950s, a time of post-war optimism and booming industry, by a man named Ancel Keys. Keys was a charismatic, forceful physiologist from the University of Minnesota, a man who walked into a room and commanded it. He possessed an ego as large as his intellect, and he had a theory: saturated fat caused heart disease. To prove it, he conducted the now famous 7 countries study. On the surface, it looked like irrefutable science. He plotted a graph showing a perfect curve. Countries that ate more fat had more heart attacks. It was elegant, it was simple, and it was terrifying. But history chose to forget the details that didn't fit the curve. Keys had access to data from 22 countries, but he selectively cherry-picked only the 7 that supported his hypothesis. He ignored France, where people ate butter and cheese in vast quantities, yet had low rates of heart disease. He ignored the nuances that contradicted his worldview. Yet, with the backing of the American Heart Association and the sheer force of his personality, Keys turned his hypothesis into law. He bulldozed over dissenters, labeling anyone who questioned him as a dangerous contrarian. By the 1970s, the diet-heart hypothesis had become the unquestioned religion of the West. Governments issued guidelines telling us to banish butter and embrace margarine, to swap eggs for cereal, to fear the steak and praise the pasta. The food industry, seeing a golden opportunity, flooded the market with low-fat products. But when you remove fat from food, it tastes like cardboard. So, to make these new, healthy products palatable, they added something else, something insidious, something they told us was harmless energy. They added sugar. And as we obediently followed the guidelines, cutting out the fats that our ancestors had eaten for millennia, we didn't get healthier. We got heavier. We got sicker. We were fighting a war against cholesterol, convinced we were saving our hearts, while the true assassin stood quietly in the corner, laughing at our ignorance. We were living a lie that had been stamped with the seal of scientific consensus, unaware that the truth had already been discovered and then brutally erased. In the shadow of Ancel Keys and his colossal reputation, there was another man, a man of quiet demeanor, a British physiologist named John Yudkin. While Keys was shouting from the rooftops about the dangers of fat, Yudkin was meticulously analyzing the same data and seeing a completely different pattern. He looked at the rising tide of heart disease not as a consequence of the butter we had always eaten, but as a parallel to a modern addiction that had skyrocketed in the 20th century, our consumption of sugar. Yudkin wasn't interested in cherry-picking data to suit a narrative. He was interested in the biological reality of the human body. As the professor of nutrition at Queen Elizabeth College in London, he began to conduct experiments that the American establishment ignored. He found that when he fed sugar to rodents and human volunteers, their blood triglycerides spiked, their insulin levels went haywire, and they developed the very precursors to heart disease that Keys blamed on fat. Yudkin realized that we were blaming the innocent bystander while the culprit walked free. In 1972, Yudkin published his findings in a book titled Pure, White, and Deadly.
It was a prophetic work. In it, he laid out with terrifying accuracy the link between sugar consumption and the epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease that were just beginning to swell. He warned us that if we continued to replace fat with sugar, we would face a public health catastrophe. It should have been a turning point. It should have been the moment the world woke up. But the sugar industry was watching, and they were not about to let their profits be threatened by a soft-spoken British professor. The reaction to Yudkin's work was not a scientific debate, it was an execution. The Sugar Research Foundation, along with powerful figures in the nutrition establishment who had staked their careers on the anti-fat dogma, launched a brutal, coordinated campaign to destroy him. They didn't just attack his data, they attacked the man. Ansel Keys himself led the charge, dismissing Yudkin's theory as a mountain of nonsense. The British Sugar Bureau put out press releases labeling his claims as emotional assertions rather than science. They strangled his research funding. They pressured journals to refuse his papers. They uninvited him from conferences. They turned Jan Yudkin into a pariah. They painted him as a quack, a lonely eccentric obsessed with a conspiracy theory. It was a character assassination so thorough and so effective that Yudkin's reputation was left in tatters. His book, which contained the vital truth that could have saved millions, was ridiculed as science fiction and pushed out of print. They didn't just want to win the argument, they wanted to bury the witness. And for 40 years, they succeeded.
John Yudkin died in 1995, a forgotten man in the world of nutrition. He passed away believing that his life's work had been in vain. He had warned the world of a coming storm, and for his trouble, he had been cast out into the cold. His books were out of print, his theories were mocked in medical schools, and the world continued to gorge itself on low-fat, high-sugar foods, oblivious to the fact that they were poisoning themselves. It is one of the great tragedies of modern science, a man who saw the future but was powerless to stop it because he lacked the political machinery of his rivals. But truth, unlike people, is impossible to kill completely. It can be buried, it can be obscured, and it can be denied, but it waits. It waits for the cracks in the lie to appear. And appear they did. By the early 2000s, the paradox was undeniable. Despite decades of following low-fat guidelines, the world was more obese and diabetic than ever before. A new generation of scientists, free from the stranglehold of the old guard, began to look at the data with fresh eyes. They found Yudkin's old papers in dusty archives. They read Pure, White, and Deadly, and were shocked to find that it read not like the ramblings of a madman, but like a precise roadmap of the modern health crisis. Prominent figures like Dr. Robert Lustig began to publicly champion Yudkin's work, declaring that Yudkin was right, they destroyed him. The scientific community began to peel back the layers of corporate influence and realized that the consensus of the 1970s was bought and paid for. Today, John Yudkin is hailed as a prophet, a visionary who was decades ahead of his time. But this vindication is bitter. It comes too late for Yudkin to hear it. It comes too late for the millions of people who suffered and died from preventable diseases because the world was sold a lie. We cannot give John Yudkin back his career. We cannot undo the humiliation he suffered at the hands of lesser men. But we can do this. We can speak his name. We can pull his story from the shadows where the industry tried to hide it. We can ensure that history remembers him not as the failure they painted him to be, but as the man who stood alone against the giants and told the truth. His warning was silenced, but his legacy is now deafening. He warned us about sugar in 1972. It took us 40 years to listen, but finally, the silence is broken.